No one should know that the book was his. At first, he had considered having it published anonymously. Later, he thought that it should be published under the name of a well-known writer. Credit his work to someone else, reverse plagiarism, to be read as if he were the writer. In the end, he decided to use a pseudonym that no one would recognize, a book designed to go unnoticed. 7. Not the oceanic, but the tidal, the retreat from condensation in the poem, writing of love, this is Joey, quote, no matter how difficult to experience and say nothing other than to utter its name. 8. The triple mirror where the body splits in its birth of pain, of joy, and of its ultimately impossible self-relation, refractory. A transom once, frequently the window in Schuyler's work, a window here in Joey's, the grayness of Brooklyn, the night settling into itself. 9. Absence must stay afloat on its own narration. This is Joey, quote, I wonder how long the page will be and if you will remain here with me, or that this could cause some kind of joy as we insisted in this act of writing one might construct a life with a few friends and the desire that it would continue. 10. Piglia again, quote, legibility is always posthumous. Joey, immersive backdrops are non-mediums like the human voice or my voice speaking out loud to you now. Muriel Rukeyser, sound is bursting the sun. HD, satisfied, unsatisfied, satiated, or numb with hunger. This is the eternal urge. This is the despair, the desire to equilibrate, the eternal variant. 11, Blanchot, I know, I imagine that this unanalyzable feeling changed what there remained for him of existence, as if the death outside of him could only henceforth collide with the death in him. Quote, I am alive. No, you are dead. 12, Leslie Scalapino, the feeling being the life of the passers-by. The past life is changed now, so couldn't have been perceived by me then. 13, Joey again, writing for the few others one needs address at least in your head, to find some way to tell them you love them without breaking down in the first moments of being in their presence. Let's bring Joey up for the first moments of his being in our presence, and join me in welcoming Joey Yearouos-Algozin to the Poetry Project.
Thanks, Judah. Oh, that was so beautiful. I don't remember your last intro either, but I can't imagine it was better than that, because that was really good, which is what I'm trying to... Okay. Never mind. How's everybody doing? Doing all right? Cool, I'm fine. Okay, great. So I'm going to read a little bit from a book that came out a couple of years ago called A Feeling Called Heaven, and then I'm going to read some really, really new stuff that I started in like the last month. And yeah, A Feeling Called Heaven is it's a guided meditation on the end of the world, or the end of the human, not the end of the world. That's presumptuous, right? Yeah. And kind of just taking the idea that we're like a biological species sort of seriously, and therefore we could go extinct. Didn't seem like too much hubris, I suppose. Okay, cool. Now that we're all on the same, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay. So the long poem, and it's called For the Second to Last Time, which is from Gilles Deleuze's an interview right before he died, where he was talking about his alcoholism. And he said that the alcoholic is always preparing the second to last drink. And I kind of felt that way about the human, that we were always preparing our sort of second to last. So it's called For the Second to Last Time. I wanted to show you something that would give you pleasure before the end of the world. I thought I'd play you a video of antelope or deer moving as a herd across an expanse of green grass, shot from the door of a helicopter, flying in unison with the animals below, as the repurposed foundation for the death of this planet in X number of years. For there's nothing to be done now but love and embrace the silence of our impending destruction as a species, offered the gift of consciousness through accident or divine fiat, that has done little with it but slightly lessened the suffering of a few, i.e., the bar was so low and desire so brutal. There's nothing to be done now but to await our own destruction in the presence of each other. This patience, then, is really all that's necessary. And not saying how the world could be better. It can't be better. A better world isn't possible, but patience is possible. Meditation on a few moments of intense deprivation, on all that's left. this impoverishment we've been given, ecstatic reduction or a feeling called heaven that speaks to itself, of nothing but a final annihilation that arrives quietly, though it remains perhaps forever in the distance. I wanted to show you something that would remind you of a time in your life before we came together, as a way of finding some trace of pleasure or happiness in the presence of each other. I want you to hold in your mind this image of a future world continuing without us, arising from a communal hope that once we've disappeared, this world will reach a quiet equilibrium, the weather again becoming pleasant, the wind no longer carrying the scent of rotting garbage or chemicals burning in the chimney of an anonymous factory, the sweet smell bringing solidity, as if the seemingly endless supply of gummy plastic burning somewhere beyond the factory's walls had reconstituted in your lungs, such that you now carry it with you in a minor way. As the plastic adheres to the cells of the walls of your lungs, it keeps you company as you walk the streets, making your way to work or to dinner after. It's not so much hope as intuition, something that you knew directly without needing to analyze it. It bridges the gap between the unconscious and conscious parts of your mind. A nonverbal certainty that a time will come when the residue of the human will have disappeared almost entirely, such that what is left of the world will come to regard our time here as a temporary illness or weak parasite that wasn't designed to kill as much as seek out its own end in the host's body. I want you to hold this image in your mind. A future that continues without us is already on its way, having begun in the far distance, not as silence, but as a faint, nearly imperceptible noise that emerges first as silence, then drowns out all other noises, a smothering nothingness that expands to take over the horizon beyond which you cannot see, as it dips below your visual plane, as you sit here listening to my voice, as we sit in the company of each other, and my voice and your thoughts become one. You begin to regard these words, what I'm saying to you now, as amounting to nothing more than clearing a place for us to rest as we wait together for the end of the world. For there's nothing to be done now besides wait, building these little monuments to ourselves along the way, say a side altar to a forgotten saint that no longer serves as a site of worship. It gives you a moment to rest and kneel along its wood railing, light a candle or two out of something like duty or habit, just something to do with your hands, briefly, before continuing on our way. But we know that there's nowhere left for us to go, that we've already arrived where we were headed, this peripheral and inconsequential space we found together. What we're building is simply this place of rest as we wait for the true end of ourselves. And so, instead of grief, what we find is pleasure. Instead of sadness, there's this feeling called heaven that touches faintly on happiness. One could say we're so happy because our time here together is short, and we've prepared our own annihilation. Now, all that's necessary is patience. All that's required of us is to patiently wait for an end we may never witness, except as the ripples of its effects, briefly visible at the edges of our time together, as though this feeling called heaven were something like the waves of the ocean, gently lapping against the wet sand, as the tide slowly rises to meet, say, a blanket spread out in the weak morning light, on which you're now calmly sitting, as you watch the day pass before you, your eyes unfocused among the gray waves. They crash near what seems like the edge of the ocean. And envisioning this kind of tranquility projected out to a great distance that only annihilation could promise, a pleasure almost too pure to experience, the final annunciation of the human in the world, spoken in a single voice in the moments leading up to the moment before the last, in which some distant generation lays down together one last time. And it goes on like that for like another, 30 pages or something. And so, okay. So that, so I gave a talk at Bard High School early college. I don't know the order of those words. But it was really interesting because when I talked to them, I read some poems, and none of the kids cared at all about what the poems meant. They just wanted to know what it was like to be a writer. And it was really interesting. So we just talked about process. They wanted to know how you got over writer's block, what kind of like tips and techniques you used. It was no like, what did this image mean? Or, oh, is that serious? Or did you mean that? Or are you kidding? Or whatever. None of that, right? Just this fantasy of like, what is it to actually be a poet? It was fascinating. And it really got me, this was yesterday, and I was like, oh, we don't talk enough about the kind of, sometimes don't talk enough about what the process it takes to get from one book to the next book, or one project to the next project. And sometimes you'll feel, or I've felt, that my projects will get stuck, where I'm rewriting the same thing over and over and over again, and kind of shittier versions of it. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I'm guessing if you're here, you're probably some kind of a writer. And so I recently, there's dear friends, Rainer Hamilton and Ted Dodson, have this project where they do February 25th, where they ask poets to imitate another poet and send in a poem that looks like that poem. And so this year, it was Lynn Haginian, My Life. And I imitated language poets enough in my 20s. I didn't need to do more of that in my 40s. And so I sent in something, but it was like, so I'm 44, I needed to do 44 sentences. And I was like, all right, that's too many sentences to write, but what if I just did it in 45 minutes? And the thing that happened was, because of the time, it felt really like open in a different way, and so it, like this whole new project opened up. And so instead of trying to just rehash previous work, which is what I felt like I've been doing since this book came out, this new thing opened up in the last like month, and so I want to share it with you, which is why the whole fucking preamble that I just had. And now, again, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. This is for you. You're welcome. All right. So I'm not going to read the numbers because I don't know how to do that and read the sentences, but there's numbers, because 44 is a long number, and so I needed to know when that stopped. Okay. So it's 45 sentences in 44 minutes. There'll be a title that's like really catchy eventually. All right. This year, I started a project with a friend about our relationship to psychoanalysis, both of us engaging in the practice as analysans and realizing that not many people write about it from the perspective of lying on the couch. Most poets fantasize about sitting upright in the chair, being in control. When I say most poets, I don't really know who I'm referring to. As I write this, it's dark outside. I'm listening to Jeff Parker's album, Mondays at the Enfield Tennis Academy. The birds that I can normally see flying outside the window are probably sleeping, like Holly, who's asleep on the couch in the other room. She just entered her 3rd trimester, and we're going to have a baby in late June, early July. The due date is July 4th, and Holly says she's going to tape her legs shut on that day to make sure we don't accidentally have a patriotic baby. We made a name up for the baby Algozard, which is a combination of our last names, even though we keep accidentally telling everyone what the real name of the baby is. I don't want to write the real name here because I don't know when this poem will be published. I decided before sitting down I'd spend 45 minutes writing this, giving myself as much time as a typical psychoanalytic session. I'm not sure if there's something intrinsically special about that amount of time, except that I can now feel it in my body. I understand when that amount of time has elapsed and start to wrap up my stories. Really, my stories always end around 5 or 10 minutes before the end of the session, and I find myself just riffing, improvising jokes, or going on little monologues about ideas that I don't really believe. The problem with writing, like the beginning or end of a particular session of analysis, is that it can feel rehearsed. I generally plan out what I'm going to say on the train, so I have about 5 minutes of material at most that I bring with me to the session. It's a kind of shield, maybe, or a way of easing into the session, as though I was still outside in the waiting room, next to the noise machine that oscillates, blowing air in my face as I browse the New Yorker that someone, not my analyst, subscribes to. I have countless pictures of the garden in the back of the building that my analyst's office is in. As a fountain, they turn off in the winter, and sometimes I show up early to just sit on a bench and watch the pigeons flying beyond the glass buildings that look over the garden. There's a way that they fly together that brings a certain kind of comfort as I wait. In the mornings in my neighborhood, pigeons sit on a streetlight above a fenced-in parking lot. Someone puts birdseed and bread out for them. I'm not sure who, because I've never seen them do it. I find it almost impossible to look my analyst in the face when I enter her office. There's something too intimate about the walk from the door to the couch. However, sometimes I bring in something I want to read to show her, or I want to read to her or show her, and we spend a few minutes looking at a book together. For whatever reason, I find this much easier. Recently, I've been reading about Shaker gift drawings and brought in a book of pictures of them to show her. Looking at it now, I turn to a page where there's a photograph of a drawing called An Emblem of the Heavenly Sphere, and the words of the artist, "Receive this sheet, it is her love." We've been talking about how when I was younger, I tried to believe in God, like really tried. Maybe even convinced myself that I did for a while, but was never able to. That something always felt like it was missing, and so I keep returning to different forms of mysticism, seeing if there's something there that I could discover for the first time. Holly says that if you weren't raised with religion, you can't really understand what believing in God feels like, and maybe she's right. I think that poetry is a kind of secular religion a lot of time, not in a bad way, but there's something there that speaks to belief, the ineffable, and mystery. Maybe poetry then is the holiest of all because it's so poor. Leonardo Buff writes that poverty is a way of being by which the individual lets things be what they are. One refuses to dominate them, subjugate them, and make them the objects of the will to power. I read that in a Fanny Howe book on the train the other night, on the way home from my job as a writing tutor. My favorite part of my train ride home is when the N goes over the Manhattan Bridge. If I'm sitting on the right side of the train, I can look out over the East River and watch the ferries and dinner cruises in the water below. There's a quiet writing at night that isn't there in the day. But at night, there's also the problem of having the weight of the day with you. This is the same with analysis, the difference between meeting with my analyst in the morning and meeting with her at night. When the sessions are ending, I can normally tell by how she moves in her chair. As the day progresses, the sun moves against the sky and shadows shift in the room. There are no birds in my neighborhood at night, only rats and the occasional skunk. I've been returning to a single image for the last year, continuously writing variations of it in my notebook. It's of the sun reflected in the broken screen of a television, lying face up on the cement outside my apartment building that I saw sometime last spring. Okay, and then this is the other one, and I'll just end with this. There are a few windows across from my apartment through which I can watch the people who live on the other side of them. I catch them moving between the frames like an Ozu movie, or at least my fantasy of an Ozu movie. Regardless, I've developed an attachment to them. I was going to say relationship, but I don't think that's the right word. I've spent so long thinking about how people relate to one another, how the people in my building will wait for each other to walk down the stairs, lingering in their doorway to avoid one another. What this means is that even though I recognize my neighbors when I see them walking around the neighborhood, I can't really remember their names with a certainty that would allow me to speak them out loud when I see them. I have a memory of someone describing Tokyo Story to me. Not so much the plot, but the way in which Ozu would frame particular shots, shooting a scene from an adjacent room so the door became a second frame. When I was younger, I wanted poetry to work like a camera, whose shutter remained open, just passively recording the world. I gave a reading once at an art space in Philadelphia with a filmmaker who showed a movie that included a long shot of a man sitting on a tractor next to a field in what I guessed was rural Pennsylvania. The man just sat there staring at the camera, and only when he waved did you realize that it wasn't a still photograph. Holly's yelling at the cat in the other room for chewing some plastic off a cardboard box. We're moving things around to get ready for the baby, and there's boxes everywhere. In New York, you come to appreciate a stranger's line of sight and make a tacit agreement with neighbors to close the blinds or wear pants when moving from room to room. In a wooden box by the door, there's a pile of unopened mail. Holly's been working on a book cover and checked out a book of aerial photography that depicts the human impact on the landscape. I've noticed a lot of photographs like these recently, as though this kind of distance feels political. I wonder what an up-close photograph of a tire in a dump can tell us that a distant one can't, even if it lacks the ability to tell us about scale. There's a deadened feeling that makes it hard to write a lot of times, so I go back to these books, not so much out of inspiration, but with the hope that I can find something worth remembering in them. But as I get older, my memory is getting worse and worse. Maybe this is why I'm attracted to forms like this, that rely less on memory and craft and more on presence. Or maybe openness is a better term. I'm surrounded by stacks of books and ungraded midterm exams. The neighbors have turned off their light and pulled down the blinds. I don't remember them when I walk in the park a few blocks from our apartment, as I only see an arm in passing in the window or catch the color of their shirt or dress. There's a silence in that park that I've discovered at night that I can't completely trust. Ever since moving to the East Coast, I'm fearful of empty spaces. There's something about the crush of people, their circulation, that makes me feel safe. And yet, I'm attracted to these solitary spaces like a desk at night, writing on a computer. Even if at nights like this, the images seem to elude me and I feel like I'm stuck just looking inward, writing about little more than writing. At least it feels honest in a way, and I can find solace in completing this task late at night while Holly's sleeping again on the couch and the door to the living room is barely open. I'm tempted to pull a book down and write out a section to you, but I won't do that. Instead, I'll keep typing. Sometimes the difficulty is reaching the end, filling the space at all, and not in choosing the right words. Literally finding enough words to keep going. I'm listening to Jeff Parker's Mondays at the Enfield Tennis Academy again. There's something about the light improvisation of these songs that feels like a good accompaniment for the kind of typing I'm doing. Maybe later I'll think about what it means to think of writing as typing and not something else. But for now, I'm enjoying the quiet and solitude of writing this out, understanding it to have a different duration than something I wrote previously. Perhaps this is more aimless. Earlier today, I was writing in my notebook about a lost friendship and thinking about the pain it introduced in my life. I was trying to come to an understanding of the difference between drifting apart and being rejected. In the former, there's the possibility that the distance can be repaired from a shared act of attention or reframing of your relationship, to insist on that shared reality with another person. Okay, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joey. That was so good. I was, you described the work, and I was like, and listening to it, felt very moved by it. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to introduce Poupeh, and then Poupeh and Joey will read again together. Poupeh Missaghi is a writer, editor, translator between English and Persian, and educator. Her books include Sound Museum and Retranslating House, both with Coffee House Press. Retranslating House 1, both with Coffee House Press. Her translations include Boys of Love by Razi Rabihavi, In the Streets of Tehran by Nila, and I'll Be Strong for You by Nassim Marashi. She is currently an assistant professor of English and literary arts at the University of Denver and a faculty mentor at the low residency MFA in creative writing at the Pacific Northwest College of Art, Portland. Reading Sound Museum is a bit of a mindfuck. How can the narrator, a prison interrogator turned museum curator, presenting their latest advancements in torture technology to a captive foreign audience, us, the readers, be so despicably deranged and simultaneously so convincingly right? Like the best novelists, Poupeh Missaghi troubles our identifications, creating a world in which the world we're convinced we believe in is undermined by the convergence of two seemingly irreconcilable positions: torture and humanism, torture and agency, torture and decolonial struggle, the conjunction in Poupeh's writing blurring into equivalence, torture as feminism, torture as agency, torture as decolonial struggle. The worldly scholar slash curator slash torturer in Sound Museum is a disturbing character because she dissolves the binaries so necessary to our sense of self, us versus them, good versus evil, etc., into an abyss of absurdity, which isn't without logic and ultimately isn't that absurd, considering, for example, the way this country is descending into an upgraded version of authoritarian liberalism, one sanctioned by institutions like universities, which, in the name of inclusivity and diversity, punish students speaking facts about the genocide in Palestine. As the curtain falls and the World War II humanitarian order merges with the fascism it once claimed to oppose, power reaches a kind of sadistic plenitude. The chains of Sekot prisoners use as ASMR to soothe the depraved senses of whoever is listening. Torture no longer needs moral justification, as the narrator in Sound Museum reminds us. It is something to be proud of, derive pleasure from, especially when the violence is inflicted by a marginalized group, like women. Quote, as one of the pioneering, high-ranking female officers in this field, I have always aspired to change the working conditions for future generations of female interrogators and torturers, end of quote. Or, quote, we women in the Middle East are suffering on both fronts, from the patriarchal men here and the Western gaze, which orientalizes and diminishes us. And how can we not agree with her? Poupeh's role was central in collecting and translating voices from Women Life Freedom, a movement formed in 2022 in response to the murder of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the morality police in Tehran. Living diasporically places us in a bind. We despise Western politics as much as we despise the regimes governing our countries. This double negation is estranging, alienating, which is how we become attuned to language. Language we denaturalize by both ventriloquizing and rejecting it. Perhaps by inhabiting the voice of the other, its cruelty and pleasure, we can eventually distance ourselves from it, a distance needed in order to write a book from the perspective of an enemy who sounds exactly like you, like us. Poupeh has our ear, we're pulled in, implicated in the very act, our complicity staged and archived through the pages of Sound Museum. By reading, we participate in this psychic dance, drawn close and repelled, our attention seized by the narrator's voice, its uninterrupted word stream organized into paragraph-long pages whose function is to celebrate the creation of a torture museum. Yes, true. Art can be evil, funded by genocidal money in service of its politics, but it can also be good by revealing just how evil it can be. And Poupeh does exactly that. Please join me in welcoming Poupeh Missaghi and Joey back to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for making it here tonight. Miran, thanks for that beautiful introduction. I guess we are going to start by reading from a shared project. Joey and I have been writing letters to each other, talking about psychoanalysis, writing, and also teaching. Yeah?
Yeah, I agree.
And it's the project is called right now Friends Better Than Flowing Waters, which is based on a line from the late Iranian poet Sohrab Sepehi. Okay, let's see. This letter is from October 10th and 11th, and I was in Denver when I wrote it to Joey. Dear Joey, I'm finally arriving here to write back in response to your last letter. I just saw Holly's pictures of the northern lights from your rooftop and come to see that you start your letter with the view from the apartment's window. As I started reading the letter, I was listening to music and thinking maybe we should start sharing the music we're listening to, if we are, while writing to each other. Thinking about the album you sent me inspired by Clarice Lispector, which I haven't yet listened to, as if I'm keeping my candies for a special occasion. And here you are in your letter too, having written of what you are listening to as you are writing. I'm always in awe of synchronicities, especially when they happen with people close to one's heart but far away geographically. I'm listening to Endless Ocean by Dastan Ensemble. I've been desiring traditional Persian music a lot recently, not surprisingly. These are tough days, spent in constant worry of the extent the warmongers can go to, watching the genocide spreading by the hour and feeling helpless. The other day, a friend sent me a clip of Harris saying in an interview that Iran is the US's #1 enemy, that it has blood of Americans on its hands. She said it as if she had memorized that line and needed to drop it in at some point in the interview for sure. And then she went on to talk about the US key ally, Israel, and I thought once again of Sound Museum's narrator. The friend Iranian American noted that she can't make herself vote. I texted back that I'm not voting for either of the two main candidates. Why does it always have to come to the choice between worst and worst, Joey? I've heard that argument so many times in the context of Iranian elections. I have voted with that same justification several times, but I don't think I can do this anymore. The images of the bodies, the body parts, the remains of tissues, they do not disappear. The sound of those surviving rushing to help, the gray of the debris covering everything, the green turned into rubble. I don't know how Palestinians in this country are making it from day to day. I can't imagine how I could do it if something similar happened to my land and my people. At every event and protest I see Palestinians, I'm in awe of their strength, their resolve, their resistance, the force of their life. John Berger wrote something beautiful about this in his essay collection, Hold Everything Dear, Dispatches on Survival and Resistance from 2007. He was a big advocate for Palestinian rights. The book includes notes from his trip to Palestine, and in it he tells stories of the people, quotes Darwish, takes apart the Western world's complicity, and the book reads as if it's written from the vantage point of today. He calls what he witnesses undefeated despair and writes, quote, despair without fear, without resignation, without a sense of defeat, makes a stance towards the world here such as I have never seen before, end of quote. That's what I see among them whenever I can show up, what we see on Instagram videos, the way Palestinians rise from the rubbles and care for one another, and continue to document and witness. No army can defeat this, no gang of murderers. Let me get back to your letter, Joey. This line, I continue to be haunted by it. Quote from Joey. And yet, I wonder about a country that has live shooter drills, asking students to pretend that they are being haunted as a way of protecting them from the chance they could be shot in their classroom, but refuses to acknowledge the literature or art that people make to understand that brutality, end of quote. Surprising, but not really, right? The fear that systems of governance have of arts and literature, the power these modes of existence and thinking hold, and yet, in the face of the politicians' money and the weapons, how does this power hold up? It is hard to bring oneself to a state of grace and forgiveness now, and to stay there, especially when the world pushes you down or to the margins. But that is the key here, I guess, to shift oneself from within and without, regardless of the world around, in spite of it. My analyst and I have been having more conversations about racism and imperialism recently, how the West-East division and all that entails continue to define our lives. A few sessions ago, we were talking about the psychoanalyst Salman Akhtar, who has inscribed a comprehensive dictionary of psychoanalysis, among dozens of other books, and my analyst quoted him from an event or conversation he had been present at. Or I should probably say this is what I remember from that conversation, that Akhtar wondered what his status and reception could have been in the world of psychoanalysis if he had originated from another part of the world, had a different skin color, a different history and culture as his roots. Racism is everywhere, in every gathering of human beings, every friend I talk to, regardless of their profession and the industry they work in. I love the language you have, Joey. Quote, what if I allowed these strangers their own reality, end of quote. What if? I want to hold space for that, allow that to expand the breathing capacity of my lungs. But then again, Joey, what happens when their reality is bombing human beings while they are sheltering in schools and hospitals? The audacity of dropping flyers on a people and asking them to either rid themselves of the terrorists or be annihilated alongside them. What is all this? And all of it supported by a world too afraid to digest and work through other traumas, or actually benefiting from the imperialism and colonialism that they were performing forever that they wanted to abolish. Back to your letter, quote, "Life blooms from these everyday moments of nothing." Another sentence of yours I'm holding on to. I'm reading lecture by Mary Capello, part of Transit Books Undelivered Lectures series. Yesterday, before I sat to read your letter and respond to you, I underlined in the book a section about Perec and Vertov on the importance of the infra-ordinary, the non-event, life caught unawares, which of course also reminded me of Bernadette Meyer's Midwinter Day. Capello discusses this as part of the politics of noting and writes, quote, "Imagine having the audacity to try to alter characteristic modes of perception and discourse by way of notation art, as Perec, as Vertov did, convinced that this is where political change begins," end of quote. Which also ties to the other notion you discuss, quote, "Rather than seeing myself as insufficient or the world as lacking, it became some present moment in which I didn't resist my life," end of quote. This present moment one lets go into reminds me of the word on, which is moment, instance in Persian, but not used in everyday language, as it is more than that, more philosophical, more spiritual, and always ties, at least for me, to the concept of an ra daryab, meaning you need to hold and behold the present moment, be fully present in it. I'm so glad to hear of these moments of shifting energy for you, Joey. I can see you glowing and becoming light as you walk the streets of New York City, and it makes me smile. And that image of you and Holly after the reading, it sounds like a scene from a movie. I wish I had been a stranger, bystander to that, or myself randomly running into the two of you. What we are doing here in these lectures is telling stories to one another. That's what teaching needs to be. Maybe I should just end here. No, I want to share one more thing before I wrap up. Go listen to this conversation between two beautiful writers, Adania Shibli and Diane Brand. Be in the presence of the power in their voices and in the complexity of their visions. Shibli talks about how Palestine is now a question of ethics. I'm so excited that soon I'll be in Brooklyn and seeing you. Can't wait.
And so this is what I said back. Okay. October 27th, Brooklyn. Dear Poupeh, it's Sunday morning and Holly's sick, sleeping in the bedroom, while I sit in the office listening to Nico Joris's Cloud Suites, an album of keyboard music Joris made while improvising with the sun and clouds in the California desert. I spent the early part of the morning reading G.K. Chesterton's book on St. Francis, which led me to reading The Saints' Canticle of the Sun while watching airplanes and birds flying against the blue sky out our third-story window. I've started reading about St. Francis after going to the Poetry Project this week and seeing my friend Farnoosh read from her new book. As an introduction to her poem, she talked about this juggler for God who danced and contorted himself in a cave in celebration of divine love. The reading itself was something like a contorted dance. Farnoosh's aunts were on a Zoom call with her, and she had them projected on the wall. They were totally wild. Once Farnoosh unmuted them, they began this nonstop talking that was barely intelligible. As Farnoosh laughed and read, she would mute and unmute them. Simultaneously, we were given bingo cards made up of different words from the poems. Whoever in the audience got bingo was to take over the reading from Farnoosh, as the aunts continued talking, singing, and showing off different things from around their house. There was a cacophony of voices and laughter. In a world of professional poets who give readings and talks as if it's their job, because it is, or the fantasy that it might someday be their job, here was Farnoosh, reveling in chaos and delighting us with something that felt so real, so immediate, so amateurish in that it was made from love. How could I not turn to St. Francis after a night like that? More than that, Farnoosh said something about her own process that I haven't been able to get out of my head. She said that the new book took her over a decade to put together because she was always searching for something else or more than what she already had, and that this book came out of learning how to look around her life and see what was already there. Isn't that beautiful? But also, isn't that what we're doing in analysis over and over again? Finding a way for the narratives about our lives to be sufficient and not a source of pain and alienation. I know I'm repeating myself, but this is the danger and pleasure of the form we've developed in these letters now. The excess of this unique kind of talking with my analyst is a process through which my own life becomes tolerable and even a source of delight and pleasure, to see what is already there. And yet, reading your last letter, this feels somehow insufficient. As you say, what if this life that we're narrating is made up of bombing others or being bombed? What if it consists of that uniquely human misery of prolonged violence and suffering, either inflicted on others or being inflicted on us? Does the slow and gradual narrative process of talking and listening, the tender quietness of analysis, fail in the face of the brutal reality of, say, Israel's genocide in Gaza and the continued war in Lebanon? I'm inclined to say yes, but I'm also inclined to hesitate before I answer as a way of continuing to write to you. I was thinking about your letters. I watched Israel bomb Iran, and then Iran in turn say that it reserved the right to retaliate. These governments continuing to demand the right to wage a violent and stupid war, as the media in the US acts as if these deaths were content or that there was a right and wrong side, rather than a continuation of misery inflicted on ordinary people. It seems to me that the governments and their support organizations are mostly complex mechanisms designed to inflict misery on our lives. I recognize the anger in your letter, but also the fatigue when you wrote, "Why does it always have to come to the choice between worse and worst? I've voted with the same justification several times, but I don't think I can do this anymore." The anger, fatigue, and what you named as despair after John Berger, which I understood as a mode of resistance and continuing in spite of the violence and pain. Reading your letter this weekend, I was struck with the underlying question you ask. How do we not succumb to numb terror, resigning ourselves to perpetual bitterness, but continue to love and live in this world? Just like you, I spent the last few weeks returning to Berger, another synchronicity, listening to interviews with him as I do the dishes or clean the apartment. In one talk on the demands of tenderness, he says that actions must be rigorously and constantly judged, either denounced or praised, but people must never be. That we must not stand in final judgment over any person. Rather, tenderness in its many manifestations is an intimate excess, rooted in direct contact with another. I've been wondering a lot about what it means to judge actions rather than people, if this is possible. When I was still a teenager, a senior in high school, my uncle was murdered during a drug deal. I'm not sure what happened, but from what I remember was that his roommate had bought some crack and OD'd. My uncle called the dealer, a kid about the same age as me, back to the house and confronted him. During the confrontation, my uncle was stabbed to death in his apartment. Madison only had 1 or 2 murders a year back then, and so it made the front page of the paper. I remembering an outpouring of sympathy from classmates, people calling my house who I'd never really spoken to outside of school. But what I mostly remember is my mother and aunt and the pain they felt over their brother's death. My Uncle Jim was schizophrenic and a violent person, never physically, at least not with me, but violent emotionally. Maybe unpredictable is a better word. What I mean is that he was clearly full of love, but not in control of himself, and that was frightening. In contrast to this love was the anger my mother and aunt had at his murder, their desire for revenge against this kid who had caused my family so much pain. Watching and listening to them, I felt that the person who murdered my uncle had nothing to do with my own grief, and that I didn't want revenge for his death, but company in my sadness and loss. It was at this moment that I became a pacifist and stopped believing in prison or punishment. What was needed was tenderness, a quiet presence of another person. Instead, there was this anger and unresolvable grief. Berger says that tenderness allows us to live alongside the dead. I think back to your letter, how you say that we give presence to the dead through our stories, to acknowledge this presence of the bodies of the dead and their continued presence in our lives. This is a quote from poupeh. How I feel living my life in the presence of ghosts, how I myself sometimes feel like a ghost to myself in the world, and how storytelling for me is to give breath to both the living and the dead, end quote. I had meant to say so much more to you today, how I had dinner with some friends, one of who's an analyst, and we didn't talk about the war, but talked about your and my project. She said that we weren't writing about psychoanalysis as much as through the pathways the practice had opened up, which I love and hope we steal. How your book just came out this week. How when you and I talked on Zoom this last week, I had already found out that Holly was pregnant, but wanted to wait until she went to the doctor in case it was a false positive, and we were getting excited for no reason. How after 2 years of trying and 1 miscarriage, we were finally pregnant, but that it's at a tender and delicate stage where it can't be taken for granted, but celebrated cautiously. How despite my pessimism about the world, I'm struck with overwhelming joy at the possibility of living with love and tenderness of a small child in our little apartment in South Brooklyn. So much more to write. More soon, as always. XO, XO, Joey.
I kind of feel bad to go to Sound Museum after like these very gentle, intimate letters, but I guess that's what we are going to do. Also, we were practicing and reading from Sound Museum all morning today for a possible play with my friend Shadi, who's here, and I just hate to read from it again, but that's what I'm going to do. So I'm gonna read from the beginning of the book, and Mirren gave some context around it. So let's see. I want to start by welcoming you to the Sound Museum. I hope the long flights were not too taxing and that your stay at the hotel has been restful so far. And I hope you're aware of what a unique opportunity we are offering you today. You're a select group of foreigners, chosen after much scrutiny and the first in the world to receive a tour of our truly exceptional establishment. I want to be conscious of your time and will get directly to the remarks. How does that sound? Yeah, okay. Wonderful, I'm glad to hear it. So let's begin with the basics. I really value transparency, unlike many of my colleagues, especially, and I'm sure this won't surprise you, my male colleagues. I came to realize during my time as an interrogator and torturer that our government was not doing a good job maintaining an archive of its establishments. I'm proud of our system, mind you, but that pride has nothing to do with the bureaucracy or the day-to-day or the documentation or lack thereof. It's all about the ideology, and even more than that, to be honest, about the spirit of power and control, the thirst for it feeding everything. And yet, and who wouldn't feel that way, especially as a woman in a patriarchal system, right? I did my best in my later years as a senior member to shift the gender balance of our workforce, recruiting and training more women. I have many success stories, especially ones about using women for interrogating male prisoners, who are often so full of themselves that they never suspect a woman might be manipulating their male privilege for her own ends, which are, in this case, one and the same with the ends of our system. For example, making them confess to what she needs, giving away some secrets, or seemingly trivial information that she can later make good use of. Maybe I'll tell you more about those achievements later, but for now, back to the main point. Unlike many dictatorial and totalitarian regimes, historically and across the globe, our government has not done a satisfactory job of documenting and archiving our interrogation and torture methods. What a loss, really. We've been doing such great work for so many years, and people on both sides of the line would agree with that, those of us within the administration and those upon whom the techniques have been used. I'm sure many would testify to that if needed, or I guess I should say, if allowed. I began to notice at some point that even though most administrators and directors shared the goal of continually honing their techniques to better serve the system, we ended up doing lots of trial and error, repeating our past methods because of this lack of systematic scientific passing on of knowledge among ourselves. So I began taking notes after my own sessions, observing sessions led by the younger team members I supervised, and talking to colleagues during our breaks or our rare shared meals or on outings for covert side projects. Only those colleagues, of course, who didn't mind sharing their knowledge. Yes, bragging was something they all did, but really looking at what they were doing to understand patterns and trends, or being willing to share their experiences in order to teach someone else something. No, that didn't happen, at least not from what I saw. I wonder whether that too is in some way related to gender, male superiors not wanting women to know their secrets for success. But then again, I've seen enough of that kind of guardedness within all male groups as well, so I'm not sure. Anyway, I did talk to those who were willing to be more observant and then pass on small bits and pieces of their knowledge. Torture scholar Dariush Rejali, a leading figure in the field, whom I'll refer to often throughout this presentation, along with his book, Torture and Democracy, confirms that interrogators do not give away their trade secrets to their rival interrogators. That strikes me as so patriarchal, because for me, from the very beginning, the aim was not just my success or that of any one individual, but rather the success of the collective. Many others say this too, but fail to implement it in reality. One of the key goals of this project is to change that mindset of secrecy. We need to become different human beings with different priorities if we are to succeed and sustain ourselves. We need to work for the good of the whole, for the collective, rather than fall into the trap of Western individualism. In the course of our history, we have learned and continue to learn from our colleagues around the world, though I'm aware that when it comes to torture, each country, era, situation, and even type of prisoner demands its own set of rules and regulations. But still, we all learn from one another. We're in the age of globalization, after all, though I think with regard to torture, we have always been globalized, according to what I've read over the years of work on this project. As my interest grew following my initial observations, I realized we needed to create a museum, a kind of archive, a learning center, and I made it my personal mission to make it happen. I'll tell you later how fucking hard it was to persuade my superiors, all with their fucking male egos, that I, whom they respected for my innovative methods and high success rates, could be the one in charge of this task force, but eventually I did. A budget was set aside, a small one in the beginning, and they allowed me to work as a one-woman team only, observing and taking notes. After a while, I found within me a growing curiosity to learn about the history of the field and the theories behind what I had practiced and seen others practice for so many years, to be able to critically think about the choices we were making in order to refine them. I think in part it had to do with the desire integral to this project to change the widely held stereotype that we, the torturers, interrogators, and prison staff in general, are just the practical hands of greater minds and not necessarily intelligent ourselves. Despite scholarship to the contrary, the public still tends to take us for imbeciles who just follow orders, for dogmatic people who follow our supreme leader with faith as unshakable as that in God. They see no agency in us. We see this to an even higher degree when it comes to our female officers, unfortunately. I've heard people bad-mouthing every woman who wears the black veil or any outfit that's more conservative, believing that all of us are either close-minded or victims, that we got our positions just because of religious or ideological leanings, not because we are educated, sophisticated, skilled human beings who have made choices and are very good at what we do. These kinds of perspectives, which make caricatures of us, are often far from true, and to be honest, they reveal more about the limited viewpoints of those who hold them than they do about us torturers. I want to make a comparison here to clarify things a bit. Think about those who work in banks and financial institutions, especially in your own countries, where banks hold so much evil power over the rest of society. Are you quick to tag everyone who works for these institutions and dreams of climbing the ladder an idiot? Of course not. You can't dismiss the complex role people's individual personalities play in their career choices, or even in their finding themselves in certain positions and deciding to continue on. That's why, in addition to building the museum, we've made sure to document our entire process. The related materials are on display in our archives wing and will later appear in a book, which will also include a transcript of my talk today. And then I'm going to skip some pages and read from another section as well, just for a bit. While we are on the subject of Americans, let me remind you, in case you have allowed yourselves to stay blind to these issues, of some of the various developments our American counterparts have made in the field of torture. Did you know that their, or I guess for some of you I could say your, military uses private contractors to provide them with interrogation services? I mean, really, come on. I understand the economic model is different from ours: capitalism, privatization, outsourcing, and doing things as efficiently as possible, but really, private contractor in our field? How to trust them, and why let them reap the benefits unless there is some financial gain in these arrangements for whoever employs the contractors? I've seen that happening here in other government sectors, so I guess our models are not that different after all, despite appearances. Or maybe it's that by giving this job to private entities, the government can, if needed, absolve itself of any wrongdoing that might enrage the public. But again, as I said, I'm of the opinion that we should be proud, should hold our heads up high with regard to the work we do. The use of contractors is brought up in the book Consequence, the memoir of a former Abu Ghraib interrogator named Eric Fair. That's another funny thing about the Americans. They do whatever they like, then write books about how they did this or that, and how sorry they are now, and how they want to expose the system, as if the system would have existed without them and their cooperation in the first place. At least these kinds of writings are useful to us. This guy, Fair, talks about how their supervisors encouraged them to be creative, which is central to our practice too. However, he points out two practices we find no use for whatsoever in our system. One, filling out the right paperwork, and two, using softened language, such as enhanced techniques to refer to torture. You know, it's funny how shocked people still are when they learn about our practices here in Iran and in the US. There are other differences too between our system and yours. Have you ever heard of General Karpinski? Well, let me tell you about her in case you haven't. She was, according to your esteemed magazine, The New Yorker, the only female commander in the war zone in Iraq, and she ran the Abu Ghraib prison. She was a business consultant before joining the prison team, and she's quoted saying that for their prisoners, quote, living conditions now are better in prison than at home. At one point, we were concerned that they wouldn't want to leave, end of quote. Imagine that. We at least aren't foolish or audacious enough to say things like that. I believe another article mentioned that none of the interrogators in the prison considered their work legally wrong, even though they might have considered it morally wrong. Our system, luckily, has resolved this issue by fusing the moral and the legal, as every law we have is based on our theological teachings and values aimed at the higher good of the people. So every act of our officers is not only legal, but also moral. I'm sorry I keep getting carried away. But I imagine the similarities and differences between our system and those of our allies and enemies globally must be of interest to all of you too. Now, let's get back to the main reason we are here, to celebrate the Sound Museum, so we can all mingle, chat, and celebrate the Sound Museum. Thank you.
Thank you, Poupeh. Thank you, Joy. Thank you for reading together. Thank you, Judah, for your beautiful intro. Also want to thank our techs working tonight, Pedro working at the sound table, Gary at Videography, Will and Heather somewhere in the kitchen, the Poetry Project staff, as well as our volunteers working tonight. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you soon.